If the man you've waited 6 months for is already buried in another town, will you keep clutching his locket or risk everything on strangers in a storm? The water barrel marked 2 fingers when Sarah Caldwell stepped from the Broken Ridge Hotel into the December morning, silver locket cold against her collarbone. 6 months she'd waited for Robert's return. 6 months of watching eastbound stages arrive without him, while her savings dwindled to $7.32. Morning, Miss Caldwell, called Ezra Walsh from his freight wagon. The merchant's greeting carried careful politeness, the kind reserved for women whose circumstances had grown uncertain. Nasty weather brewing, storm clouds building over Devil's Canyon. Sarah nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. The locket shifted beneath the fabric, its silver catching what little sunlight penetrated the gathering clouds. Inside lay Robert's photograph, taken the day he'd proposed marriage and promised to establish their homestead claim in Oregon Territory. That was before the mining job in Colorado had called him away, before the letters had stopped coming, before hope had hardened into practical necessity. The depot sat at Broken Ridge's eastern edge, where the stage road curved toward the plains. Sarah had walked this path daily for weeks, checking schedules and hoping for enough money to leave. Inside the depot, Station Master Flynn sorted telegraph messages with methodical precision. His grey moustache twitched as he looked up from his work. "Eastbound's running late today," he announced. "Scheduled for 3 o'clock, but this storm might delay departure till tomorrow." Sarah approached the ticket window, the yellowed postcard trembling in her hand. She'd read Robert's message countless times, wearing the edges soft with handling, "Coming home for Christmas." Trust me, the postcard bore a Denver postmark from August, 4 months of silence since. "I need passage to Denver," she said, voice steady despite her uncertainty. Flynn's bushy eyebrows rose. "That's $43, miss. Plus 5 more if the weather holds us over." "I understand." Sarah set the postcard on the counter, buying time while she calculated her dwindling options. The depot door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and heavy footsteps. Sarah turned to see a tall stranger in a sheepskin coat, his face weathered by wind and hard travel. He carried a leather satchel and wore the purposeful expression of a man accustomed to solving problems. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Daniel Morse. I'm looking for information about stage connections to Oregon Territory." Flynn consulted his schedule book. "Eastbound to Denver connects with the Northern Pacific, but you'll need to reach Cheyenne by Friday to make the connection. With this storm, that's looking doubtful." The stranger Daniel glanced at Sarah with brief curiosity before focusing on Flynn's explanation. She found herself studying his hands, noting calluses that suggested ranch work rather than mining or gambling. His boots showed the careful maintenance of a man who valued practical things. "What about freight wagons?" Daniel asked. "Any merchants heading west after the holidays?" "Walsh might take passengers for the right price," Flynn suggested, "though his route goes through some rough country, not suitable for folks seeking comfort." Daniel nodded, then turned to Sarah. "Pardon me, miss, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you traveling alone to Denver?" The question carried no impropriety, merely practical concern. Sarah lifted the locket, using the gesture to buy thinking time. "I'm considering my options." "Travel's uncertain in winter," Daniel said. "Especially for—" He caught himself before finishing the observation, but Sarah understood. "Especially for women traveling without male protection, without sufficient funds, without clear destinations." Flynn cleared his throat. "Stage leaves at 3, weather permitting. Tickets must be purchased 30 minutes prior to departure." Sarah tucked the postcard into her reticule. 2 hours to find $43, or accept that waiting had become her permanent occupation. The locket felt heavier as she walked toward the door, its silver warmth contrasting with the cold certainty that some promises died from neglect rather than betrayal. Outside, snow had begun falling, fat flakes that stuck to her shawl like frozen tears. The water barrel beside the depot showed 1.5 fingers deep, enough for one more day if the storm passed quickly. But storms in Wyoming Territory had their own schedules, indifferent to human plans and stage connections. Daniel emerged behind her, settling his hat against the wind. "Miss, if you don't mind my asking, Do you have people waiting in Denver? Sarah considered lying, spinning stories of family and secure destinations. Instead, she found herself speaking truth. I'm looking for someone who may no longer want to be found. Daniel studied her face, seeming to weigh her words against some internal calculation. That's honest, at least. More than most folks manage when they're desperate. The observation stung because it rang true. Desperation had become her constant companion, coloring every decision and narrowing every choice to simple survival. The locket pressed against her throat like a reminder of better times when the future had seemed certain and love sufficient to overcome practical difficulties. Good luck with your travels, Mr. Morse, she said, turning toward the hotel, Miss Caldwell. His voice stopped her. If you're willing to share wagon passage and don't mind rough travel, I might know of an arrangement. Nothing fancy, but it would get you to Denver for less than stage fare. Hope fluttered in her chest like a caged bird testing its wings. What kind of arrangement? I'll speak with Walsh about sharing freight space. Split the cost, share the risks. But I should warn you, wagon travel in winter means camping rough, eating trail food, and trusting strangers with your safety. Sarah touched the locket, feeling the photograph's edges through silver and silk. Robert had trusted her to wait, to believe in promises that had grown threadbare with time. Perhaps it was her turn to take risks. I'll consider your offer, Mr. Morse, but I need to settle my affairs first. Snow fell heavier as she walked back to the hotel, each flake a reminder that time moved forward regardless of human hesitation. The water barrel would be down to one finger by evening, and the eastbound stage would leave with or without her at 3 o'clock. In her hotel room, Sarah spread her possessions across the narrow bed, the postcard, the locket, her few good dresses, and the leather gloves Robert had given her last Christmas. Practical things and sentimental ones, the accumulated evidence of a life suspended between past promises and future uncertainties. The locket opened with a soft click, revealing Robert's photograph and the inscription he'd engraved. Forever yours, R.C. She'd traced those letters countless times, wearing the silver smooth beneath her fingertip. Now they seemed less like a promise than a question demanding answer. Outside her window, the stranger's boots paced the floor above, restless as her own uncertainty. 1 hour remained before the stage departure. 1 hour to choose between safety and risk, between waiting and motion, between the life she'd planned and the one that might still be possible. The locket snapped closed, its silver surface reflecting her face like a mirror demanding decision. 1 finger of water remained when Sarah descended to the hotel's main floor, silver locket secured beneath her traveling clothes and the yellowed postcard tucked safely in her reticule. She'd made her choice, or perhaps the choice had made itself through accumulated necessity and dwindling options. Daniel Morse sat at the corner table, sharing coffee with Walsh, the freight merchant. Their conversation carried the practical tone of men accustomed to solving problems through negotiation and careful planning. Sarah approached, noting how both men rose as she joined them. Miss Caldwell, Daniel said. Walsh here's agreed to take 2 passengers to Denver for $25 each. That's shared wagon space, trail rations, and camping gear included. Walsh nodded, his weathered face serious. Fair warning, miss, it's not comfortable travel. We'll make camp in whatever shelter we can find, eat beans and hardtack most days, and trust the weather to cooperate. Storm like this could add 3 days to the journey, Sarah calculated quickly. $25 left her, with enough remaining funds to survive several weeks in Denver while searching for Robert, or if necessary, for work to sustain herself. The mathematics of survival had become simpler over recent months, reduced to basic arithmetic of income versus expenditure. When would we depart? She asked. Soon as the storm passes, Walsh replied. Could be tonight, if the wind dies down. Tomorrow morning, more likely. I've got supplies to deliver in Cheyenne, then passengers to transport to Denver. Weeks' travel, weather permitting. Through the hotel window, Sarah watched snow accumulate on the stage road. The depot's boards remained nailed across the ticket window, Flynn having declared the eastbound cancelled until conditions improved. Her original plan lay buried beneath white uncertainty, but this new possibility offered forward motion at reduced cost. I'll need an hour to gather my things, she said. Daniel's expression showed approval mixed with concern. Pack light. What doesn't fit in one traveling bag stays behind. Upstairs, Sarah surveyed her possessions with new criteria. The good dresses wouldn't survive wagon travel, but they might bring a few dollars if sold to Mrs. Peterson at the dress shop. Her sewing kit was essential, as were the warm undergarments and her father's old coat. The locket and postcard claimed space in her reticule, along with what remained of her savings. She paused over Robert's leather gloves, their soft brown surface worn smooth from use. He'd insisted she keep them when he departed for Colorado, claiming her hands needed protection from Wyoming's harsh climate. Now they seemed less like practical gifts than symbols of care that had outlasted its giver. A soft knock interrupted her packing. "Sarah? It's Mrs. Henley." The midwife entered at Sarah's invitation, her medical bag suggesting official business rather than social calling. Mrs. Henley had attended Sarah's birth 22 years ago and had provided informal counsel during the months of waiting for Robert's return. "I heard you're leaving with the freight wagon," Mrs. Henley said, settling into the room's single chair. "Dangerous travel for a woman alone." "Mr. Morse seems reputable," Sarah replied, continuing to fold clothes. "And my alternatives have grown limited." Mrs. Henley studied Sarah's face with the practiced eye of a woman who delivered babies and buried hopes in equal measure. "Child, there's something you should know before you chase ghosts to Denver." Sarah's hands stilled on Robert's gloves. "What do you mean?" "I tended a miner from Colorado last month," Mrs. Henley said. "He worked the Leadville claims with a man named Robert Caldwell." The locket burned against Sarah's throat. "And he's buried there." September. Before the first snow, Sarah sank onto the bed, Robert's gloves sliding from her lap. The postcard in her reticule. "Coming home for Christmas. Trust me." Stared back at her like a cruel joke. Sarah opened the locket, studying Robert's photograph through eyes that saw him clearly for the first time in months. Young, optimistic, unprepared for the realities that had killed him in a Colorado mining camp while she'd waited faithfully in Wyoming territory. "The freight wagon's still good travel," Mrs. Henley continued. "Denver's got opportunities for women willing to work. Sewing shops, boarding houses, even some of the newer businesses that hire female clerks. You think I should go? I think you should live. And living means more than waiting for dead men to keep promises." Through the window, Sarah could see Walsh loading supplies into his freight wagon. Daniel Morse helped secure canvas covers against the continuing snowfall. Practical men engaged in practical work, moving forward despite uncertain weather and difficult conditions. Sarah closed the locket, its silver surface warm from her palm. Robert was gone, had been gone for months while she'd constructed elaborate hopes from silence and delayed mail. But his gloves remained real, tangible proof that care could outlast its giver if transformed into different kinds of courage. "Mrs. Henley," she said, decision crystallizing like ice forming on still water. "Would you buy these dresses? I'll need the money for travel expenses." The midwife smiled, understanding passing between women who'd learned to measure hope in practical increments. "I'll give you fair price. And Sarah, when you reach Denver, find work that uses your mind as well as your hands. You've got sense enough to build something lasting." 20 minutes later, Sarah emerged from the hotel with a single traveling bag and $12 additional from the dress sale. The locket hung beneath her traveling clothes, Robert's photograph transformed from future promise to past blessing. His gloves warmed her hands as she approached Walsh's wagon, where Daniel Morse waited with patient courtesy. "Ready for rough travel?" he asked, helping her climb aboard. Sarah settled among the supply crates and canvas covers, testing the wagon's unfamiliar motion. Through the falling snow, she could see the depot where she'd planned to buy stage passage to chase a ghost. Now she was heading toward the same destination for different reasons, with living companions instead of dead hopes. "Ready," she said, meaning it. The wagon lurched into motion, wheels cutting through accumulated snow toward whatever lay beyond Broken Ridge's familiar limitations. Sarah touched the locket one final time, then pulled Robert's gloves higher on her wrists and faced forward into the storm. Half a finger of water showed in the barrel when the blizzard struck in earnest, transforming Walsh's freight wagon into a canvas-covered ark struggling through white infinity. Sarah huddled between supply crates, Robert's leather gloves her only warmth as wind howled around them with personal malice. "There!" Daniel shouted over the storm, pointing toward a dark shape barely visible through driving snow. "Looks like a line shack." Walsh guided the horses toward shelter, their breath streaming like desperate prayers in the frigid air. The structure revealed itself as a one-room cabin built to house railroad crews, abandoned but intact. Within minutes, they'd unhitched the team and crowded inside with essential supplies. Daniel struck a match, rough walls, a stone fireplace. "We'll wait out the storm. Tonight, maybe 3 days." Relief outweighed complaint. After hours of wagon motion, the cabin's walls felt solid. Sarah stowed her bag and helped Daniel spread bedrolls. Walsh sparked the fire, movements clipped. "Good thing you packed light, miss. Storm like this, heavy baggage stays behind." Flames caught, warm against the wind's fury. Sarah peeled off Robert's gloves, practical protection, more use now than sentiment. "Coffee?" Daniel set beans in a pot. Nothing special, but hot. She wrapped her hands around the tin cup. Bitter, perfect, ritual warmth against the storm. Through the cabin's single window, snow fell with hypnotic steadiness, erasing the outside world one flake at a time. "Where in Denver are you headed?" Daniel asked, settling beside the fire. Sarah considered her answer. The postcard had given her an address, Robert's intended lodging, but that destination had died with him in a Colorado mining camp. "I'm not certain yet. I'll need to find work, probably lodging in a boarding house until I establish myself." "What kind of work?" Walsh inquired, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Sewing, if I can find it. I've also kept books for the hotel back in Broken Ridge. Numbers come naturally to me." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Denver's growing fast. Businesses need folks who can handle accounts and correspondence. Might pay better than seamstress work." The conversation felt different from the careful politeness she'd grown accustomed to in Broken Ridge, where her uncertain status had made others uncomfortable. Here, traveling toward unknown destinations, the usual social calculations seemed less important than immediate survival and mutual assistance. "What takes you to Denver, Mr. Morse?" she asked. "Cattle business. I'm representing a group of Wyoming ranchers who want to establish direct sales connections instead of going through Chicago middlemen. Denver's become a significant market for beef." Sarah found herself interested, despite her exhaustion. "That sounds like complex negotiations, more than you'd think. It's about building relationships, understanding local needs, finding reliable partners." Daniel studied her face in the firelight. "Actually, that kind of work requires someone good with details and correspondence, someone who understands both the ranch perspective and business protocols." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from their fire. Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest, not hope exactly, but possibility. For months, she'd defined herself through waiting and loss, measuring time in disappointment and diminishing resources. But here, sheltered from the storm with practical strangers, she glimpsed different potential futures. "I've never worked in cattle business," she said carefully, "but you understand numbers, and you've managed correspondence for the hotel. The ranchers I represent need someone who can handle Denver negotiations while they manage operations back in Wyoming." Walsh looked up from tending the fire. "Makes sense. Lady's got sense enough to travel light and adapt to circumstances. That counts for something in business." Sarah pulled Robert's gloves from her lap, studying their worn leather surface. He'd given them to her for protection against Wyoming's harsh weather, never imagining they'd warm her hands during a flight from his memory toward an uncertain future. Now they seemed like symbols of transformation rather than loss, practical gifts that served new purposes. "Would this position require staying in Denver permanently?" she asked. "Through spring, certainly. Maybe longer if the arrangements prove profitable. The ranchers are building something that could last for years." Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on their shelter, but inside, the cabin felt warm and secure. Sarah looked around at her companions, men who'd offered practical help without demanding explanation or judgment, who'd shared food and fire and possibility with a stranger whose circumstances they understood imperfectly but accepted completely. "I'd be interested in learning more about the position," she said quietly. Daniel smiled. the expression reaching his eyes. Then we'll talk more when we reach Denver. For now, let's concentrate on surviving this storm. Sarah nodded, tucking the gloves into her traveling bag beside the locket and postcard. The silver pendant felt lighter somehow, as if Robert's photograph had shed the weight of unfulfilled promises and taken on the gentler burden of cherished memory. The postcard remained a reminder of Hope's fragility, but also of her own capacity to adapt when circumstances demanded change. The fire crackled, throwing shadows on the cabin walls, while snow accumulated outside their temporary refuge. Sarah closed her eyes, listening to wind that no longer sounded like personal threat, but like natural force to be weathered and outlasted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and different weather, but tonight she was warm and safe and surrounded by people who'd offered kindness without condition. For the first time in months, the future felt larger than the past. The water showed empty when Sarah woke to silence, so complete it felt dangerous. The blizzard had passed during the night, leaving their shelter surrounded by snow deeper than the cabin's windows. Through the small glass pane, she could see only white, interrupted by the dark shapes of buried trees. "We're snowed in proper," Walsh announced, surveying their situation with grim practicality. "Could be days before we can dig out the wagon." Daniel worked to restart the fire from last night's coals. "How much food do we have?" "3 days of full rations if we're careful," Walsh replied. 5 days if we stretch it thin. Sarah felt the familiar weight of the locket against her throat, but this time it brought comfort rather than anxiety. She'd survived 6 months of uncertainty in Broken Ridge. She could survive a few days, trapped in a line shack with decent companions. The difference was motion versus stasis, shared challenge versus solitary waiting. "I can help with the rationing," she offered, pulling on Robert's gloves. "I manage supplies for the hotel kitchen." "Good," Walsh said. "We'll need to be smart about conserving heat, too. That means staying close, sharing blankets, keeping the fire small but constant." Through the morning, they developed routines for survival in confined space. Sarah organized their food supplies with careful efficiency, calculating portions that would sustain 3 adults through an uncertain duration. Daniel and Walsh took turns maintaining the fire and checking their small store of firewood. When conversation lagged, they shared stories that passed time without requiring excessive energy. By noon, the silence outside had grown oppressive. Sarah found herself listening for sounds that never came: wind, animal movement, any indication that the world beyond their shelter still existed. The cabin felt smaller with each passing hour, its walls pressing closer despite unchanged dimensions. "How often do storms like this hit?" she asked, needing words to break the quiet. 2, 3 times a winter," Walsh replied. "Sometimes worse. I've been snowed in for a week before, up near Laramie. Lost 2 horses to cold that time." Daniel studied the single window, its glass frosted thick with ice. "The main thing is not to panic. Weather always breaks eventually." But Sarah could see worry lines around his eyes, subtle signs that their situation was more precarious than his calm words suggested. She touched the postcard in her reticule, remembering Robert's confidence when he'd written, "Trust me," in his careful script. Trust, she'd learned, was a luxury that circumstances could make impossible to afford. Afternoon brought new problems. Their firewood supply dwindled faster than expected, forcing them to choose between warmth and cooking. Sarah suggested cold meals to conserve fuel, a practical decision that made their confined space feel even more like a trap. "There's deadfall outside," Daniel observed, studying the area visible through their small window. "If I could get to it." "Too dangerous," Walsh interrupted. "Snow's too deep, and it's still falling. Easy to lose direction, freeze to death 10 feet from the door." Sarah pulled Robert's gloves tighter, thinking of practical solutions. "What about burning some of the supply crates?" "The empty ones?" Both men looked at her with surprise, then growing approval. "That's thinking like a survivor," Walsh said. "Cargo can be replaced. People can't." They broke up 2 wooden crates, using the planks to feed their fire through the evening. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, while wind began building outside again, promising another night of storm. Sarah found herself grateful for the confined space that had seemed stifling hours earlier. "Tell me about this cattle business." she said to Daniel, partly from genuine interest and partly to distract them all from their precarious situation. Wyoming's got the best grazing land in the territory, but the middlemen in Chicago take most of the profit, Daniel explained. Direct sales to Denver could change that. Let ranchers build something lasting instead of just surviving season to season. Like building a cooperative? Sarah asked, remembering discussions she'd overheard at the hotel. Exactly. Pool resources, share risks, split profits fairly, instead of letting outside interests control the market. Walsh nodded approvingly. Smart thinking. I've seen too many good ranchers go under because they couldn't get fair prices for their cattle. Sarah found herself thinking about community structures, about ways people could support each other instead of competing for limited resources. The conversation reminded her of Mrs. Henley's work in Broken Ridge, building networks of mutual assistance that helped women survive difficult circumstances. What kind of person would you need to manage the Denver end? She asked. Someone who understands both ranching and business, Daniel replied. Someone who can negotiate with meatpackers and restaurant owners, keep accurate books, handle correspondence with multiple ranches. Someone trustworthy, Walsh added. Ranchers are independent folks. They need to know their Denver representative won't cheat them or make promises that can't be kept. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling their cabin's walls with renewed fury. Sarah realized the storm hadn't finished with them yet, that their already precarious situation was about to become more dangerous. But instead of panic, she felt a strange calm settling over her thoughts. How much would such a position pay? She asked. Daniel looked surprised by her directness, then smiled. Enough to live comfortably in Denver, plus a percentage of any improved profits from direct sales. Could be quite good money if the arrangements work out. And if they don't work out, then you'd have several months of guaranteed salary while looking for other opportunities. Denver's a growing city with plenty of options for someone with your skills. Sarah opened the locket, studying Robert's photograph in the firelight. His young face looked back at her with optimism that had been crushed by circumstances beyond his control. But his leather gloves had survived him, had protected her hands during wagon travel, and would continue providing practical warmth regardless of what tomorrow might bring. I'm interested in the position, she said quietly. Assuming we survive this storm. We'll survive, Daniel said with conviction that felt like a promise. And when we reach Denver, we'll start building something that lasts. Outside, the wind howled with renewed violence, but inside their small cabin, 3 people shared warmth and hope and the practical determination that kept humans alive in hostile country. Sarah closed the locket, tucking Robert's memory safely away beside plans for a future she was finally ready to create. The fire crackled, throwing light against walls that no longer felt like prison barriers but like shelter strong enough to protect dreams worth building. Empty barrel, empty sky, and the sound of shovels breaking through snow toward buried hope. Sarah woke to daylight, streaming through the cabin window, and Walsh already working to clear a path to their wagon. The storm had passed, leaving behind crystalline air so clear it hurt to breathe. 3 feet deep, but we can dig out, Walsh called through the door. Storm's over for good this time. Sarah pulled on Robert's gloves and joined the excavation work, using a broken crate board to help move snow. The physical labor felt good after 2 days of enforced confinement, her muscles grateful for purposeful motion. Daniel worked beside her, their breathing visible in the frigid air as they carved a tunnel toward their buried transportation. Horses seem fine, Daniel reported, checking the makeshift shelter they'd constructed against the cabin's north wall. Hungry, but they've weathered worse storms than this. By noon, they had the wagon freed and loaded, ready to resume their journey toward Denver. The landscape around them had transformed into an alien white wilderness, familiar landmarks erased by wind and snow. Only Walsh's careful attention to compass directions kept them oriented toward their destination. 2 days to Denver if the road's clear, Walsh estimated, guiding the horses through snow that reached their bellies. 3 if we hit more weather. Sarah settled among the supply crates, grateful for the motion that meant progress toward an uncertain but increasingly appealing future. The cattle business proposition had gained substance during their storm-bound conversations, evolving from vague possibility into concrete opportunity. Tell me more about the ranchers you represent, she said to Daniel as they traveled. 5 families, all with spreads in the Powder River country. Good people who've been fighting drought, harsh winters, and unfair market prices for years. They need someone in Denver who can build relationships with meat packers, restaurant owners, maybe even some of the mining camps that need regular beef supplies. What about housing in Denver? I'll need somewhere to live. There's a boarding house near the stockyards run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. Clean rooms, good meals, reasonable rates. Most of the cattle buyers stay there when they're in town. The wagon lurched through a deep drift, throwing Sarah against Daniel's shoulder. She felt the solid warmth of him through their winter coats, the steady presence of someone accustomed to solving problems through practical action rather than elaborate planning. I should tell you, she said quietly, I've never been married. The name Caldwell belonged to someone who won't be joining me in Denver. Daniel studied her face with careful attention. That must have been difficult to decide. The deciding got done for me. But I wanted you to know before we reach the city. Thank you for the honesty, Daniel said. For what it's worth, the ranchers care more about competence than social standing. They need results, not respectability. The conversation felt like shedding weight, like removing layers of protection that had become burdensome rather than useful. Sarah touched the locket through her coat, feeling Robert's photograph settle into its proper place as cherished memory rather than governing principle. Afternoon brought them to a river crossing where ice looked thick enough to bear the wagon. Walsh tested the surface, then urged the horses forward. Halfway across, a deep groan rolled under their feet, the ice trembling like a drumskin. Sarah felt the vibration climb through the wagon wheels into her bones and clutched Daniel's arm in reflex. It's holding, Walsh said evenly. Ice talks a lot before it breaks. They reached the far bank without disaster, but Sarah's pulse hammered as if the river still moved beneath her. The incident reminded her how quickly circumstances could shift from manageable to dangerous, how survival often depended on trusting other people's expertise in situations beyond one's own experience. You did well back there, Daniel observed. Stayed calm when things got uncertain. I've had practice with uncertainty lately, Sarah replied. Evening found them camped in a grove of cottonwoods where Walsh had sheltered during previous journeys. The trees provided windbreak while they prepared a hot meal over an open fire, their first cooked food in 3 days. Sarah contributed canned tomatoes from her personal supplies, transforming basic beans into something approaching a feast. Tomorrow we should reach the Denver outskirts, Walsh said, consulting his pocket watch. Thursday morning, we'll be at the stockyards. Sarah felt anticipation mixed with nervousness at the prospect of reaching their destination. Denver represented opportunity, but also the unknown quantity of starting over in an unfamiliar place without established connections or guaranteed income. What happens first when we arrive? She asked Daniel. I'll introduce you to Mrs. Patterson. Help you get settled in the boarding house. Then we'll meet with the stockyard managers, start building relationships that will benefit the ranchers. And if I'm not suitable for the work? Daniel smiled, the expression carrying genuine warmth despite the evening cold. Then we'll find something else that matches your abilities. Denver's got opportunities for people willing to work and adapt. Sarah pulled Robert's gloves higher on her wrists, feeling their familiar comfort. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and different requirements, but she'd survived the worst of winter weather with strangers who'd become trusted companions. That seemed like preparation enough for whatever awaited in the city. The fire crackled between them, casting light on faces that had grown familiar through shared hardship and mutual assistance. Sarah realized this was what she'd been missing during her months of solitary waiting in Broken Ridge, the sense of moving towards something rather than away from it, of building rather than merely enduring. Mrs. Patterson serves excellent coffee, Daniel said, as if reading her thoughts. Much better than trail coffee. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the cold air like a promise of better days ahead. Then I'm looking forward to meeting her. She was, she realized, looking forward to tomorrow, to Denver, to work that would use her mind and abilities rather than simply consuming time while she waited for someone else to determine her future. The locket felt light against her throat, and Robert's gloves warmed her hands like blessings transformed into practical tools for building whatever came next. The stars emerged overhead, sharp and clear in the thin air, pointing toward destinations that suddenly felt achievable rather than merely hoped for. The Denver depot bustled with Thursday morning energy as Sarah stood beside Walsh's empty wagon, her single traveling bag in one hand and Daniel Morse's business card in the other. The city stretched around them larger, noisier, and more complex than Broken Ridge by orders of magnitude, but somehow less intimidating than she'd expected. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house is 2 blocks north, Daniel explained, pointing past the stockyards toward a district of neat houses and commercial buildings. She's expecting you, and the ranchers have authorized advance payment for your first month's lodging. Sarah touched the locket beneath her traveling clothes, feeling Robert's photograph settle into its new role as pleasant memory rather than governing principle. His leather gloves protected her hands from the morning cold, practical tools that would serve her well in whatever work lay ahead. "When do I meet the stockyard managers?" she asked. "This afternoon. I've arranged appointments with 3 different firms who handle cattle purchasing for the Denver market." Daniel's expression carried confidence mixed with genuine concern for her success. "You'll do well, Sarah. You've got the right combination of practical sense and adaptability." Walsh finished securing his wagon covers, preparing for the return journey to Wyoming. "Good luck in the city, miss. You've got more courage than most folks twice your age." Sarah shook both men's hands, grateful for their assistance during the journey that had transformed her from waiting woman to working woman. The yellowed postcard remained in her reticule, but its message had changed meaning entirely, no longer a promise to fulfill, but a reminder of her own capacity to survive disappointment and create new possibilities. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house proved exactly as Daniel had described. Clean, comfortable, and populated by people engaged in the practical business of making Denver work. The widow herself was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with graying hair and the efficient manner of someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. "Mr. Morse spoke highly of your organizational abilities," Mrs. Patterson said, showing Sarah to a corner room with windows facing both the mountains and the city's commercial district. "The cattle business keeps irregular hours, but we serve meals punctually at 6, 12, and 6. Coffee's always available in the kitchen." Sarah set her traveling bag on the room's single chair, noting the writing desk positioned to catch morning light. Perfect for correspondence and record-keeping, the kind of detailed work that would be essential in managing relationships between Wyoming ranchers and Denver meat buyers. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. This will suit me perfectly." "Good. There's a woman's dress shop 3 blocks east if you need business attire, and the bank stays open until 4 o'clock for those needing to establish accounts." Practical information delivered without judgment or excessive curiosity, exactly what Sarah needed as she began building a new life from careful planning rather than desperate hope. She unpacked her few possessions, hanging her traveling dress and arranging her sewing kit and writing materials with methodical care. The silver locket went on the nightstand, its chain coiled neatly beside Robert's photograph. Not hidden away, but not worn constantly, either available for memory when needed, but not governing daily decisions. His leather gloves she kept close, practical tools for practical work. That afternoon, Daniel introduced her to Samuel Morrison at Rocky Mountain Meatpackers, a gruff man with shrewd eyes who evaluated people based on their ability to deliver promised results rather than their social credentials. "Wyoming beef's good quality," Morrison acknowledged, "but transportation costs eat into profit margins. Direct purchasing could work if the ranchers can guarantee regular delivery schedules and consistent quality." Sarah took notes in the careful script she'd developed during months of hotel bookkeeping, asking questions about volume requirements, seasonal variations, and payment terms. The work felt familiar despite its new context, organizing information, building relationships, creating systems that served multiple parties fairly. "The ranchers can provide monthly delivery contracts starting in March," she said, consulting her notes. 200 head per month, with quality guaranteed by their cooperative inspection process. Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's the kind of specificity we need. Can you have written proposals ready by next week?" "Certainly." The meeting ended with firm handshakes and scheduled follow-up appointments. Sarah felt the satisfaction of work engaged properly, of abilities employed in service of genuine mutual benefit rather than mere survival. Walking back to the boarding house through Denver's busy streets, she reflected on the distance traveled, not just the miles from Broken Ridge to Denver, but the transformation from woman defined by waiting to woman defined by working. The postcard in her reticule bore witness to that change, its faded message now serving as reminder of her own resilience rather than monument to disappointment. Evening found her at Mrs. Patterson's dining table, sharing beef stew and conversation with fellow boarders who worked in Denver's expanding economy. A bank clerk, a telegraph operator, a woman who managed a millinery shop, people building lives through practical effort and mutual assistance rather than depending on others to determine their circumstances. The cattle business is growing fast, observed the telegraph operator. We send dozens of messages daily coordinating shipments between ranches and meat packers. That's good news for the Wyoming cooperative, Sarah replied. Direct sales could benefit everyone if managed properly. Later, in her room, she wrote her first letter to the Powder River ranchers, describing the day's meetings and outlining preliminary agreements with Morrison's firm. The work felt substantial, like building something that would last beyond immediate necessity. Through her window, Denver's lights stretched toward the mountains, marking a city that had grown from frontier outpost to regional center through the accumulated efforts of people willing to take risks and work together. Sarah understood now that she'd become part of that ongoing creation, contributing her abilities to something larger than individual survival. The locket gleamed on her nightstand, Robert's photograph visible through its open case. His smile looked different now, less like unfulfilled promise and more like blessing granted from beyond earthly concerns. The leather gloves lay beside her writing materials, ready for tomorrow's work in service of practical dreams that seemed increasingly achievable. Outside, a train whistle echoed across the city, calling travelers toward destinations that might transform them as completely as the journey from Broken Ridge had transformed her. Sarah smiled, thinking of other women who might be listening to that sound while calculating the cost of motion versus the price of staying still. She closed the locket gently, turned down her lamp, and settled into sleep surrounded by the sounds of a living city rather than the silence of suspended hope. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.